Hello, the title of my presentation is Balancing Practical Agility with Psychometric Rigor and the Validation of a Game-Based Assessment. So before I jump right in, a quick introduction to what a game-based assessment, or GBA for short. So GBA is an assessment method in which the candidates participate in a variety of situations through gameplay. These games will elicit the relevant skills and behaviors. Then the data will be collected, then coded to infiltrate information about the candidates. In recent times, there has been growing interest and exploration of GBAs in recognition of its potential benefits over traditional assessment methods. These include things like increasing test taker motivation, as well as reducing biases and faking. So why did we choose to try the GBA? Aside from recognizing that the GBA is an innovative methodology, we also saw potential for the GBA to provide a gamified assessment format which will value add our existing selection process. At the same time, an early review of the psychometric qualities also seemed promising, and there was high face validity, which is important in a practical setting. So for our purpose, we wanted to try the GBA for our scholarship award selection process. We wanted to see if the GBA could help us to better identify suitable candidates who would perform well in public service subsequently. We will then award these individuals with scholarships. So the main focus of my presentation will be my sharing about how we mitigated the risk of trying a GBA through the sharing about our validation journey, which is slightly different from a typical validation process. I will also emphasize on the actions we took to manage the risk involved, as well as the decisions made and the rationale behind them. So this is what a typical validation process looks like. The first, you'll propose the use for the assessment tool and set the intended outcome. Secondly, you will design the validation effort, which consists of reviewing existing information and also deciding on a strategy. Thirdly, a pilot test will be done and the data will be collected and analyzed. Following that, there will be a recommendation on the appropriate use of the selection procedure or tool. Last but not least, there will also be a review of the validation as and when needed in the future. So before I talk about our validation process, I would first like to share about some of the complexities we face, which is common when we're trying out a GBA tool or any tool in a real-world setting. This is because the context will bring about certain complexities. In our case, the first complexity was that the GBA was quite new. This means that there were relatively few research studies on its use for the selection assessment context, in the local context, and also in comparison to traditional assessment methods. Secondly, we were also trying out the GBA tool in a scholarship context. This meant that there will be issue with the collection of job performance data, because the candidates that were deemed successful would go on to study and only begin work in the organization minimally 5 to 7 years down the road. This meant that there will be increased difficulty in establishing predictive criterion validity since the data will take a long time to be available. Thirdly, the particular GBA tool that we were trying out was also a tool developed by a vendor and was taken off the shelf. This meant that there was some ambiguity with how the tool and constructs were developed. At the same time, there will also be a lack of clarity on the scoring algorithm since it was designed by the vendor. Last but not least, in our context, we were also taking a more exploratory approach with the intention for us to really be open to trying out the GBA and to see whether it could be used for our process. So on to our validation process. So the first part will be quite similar to a typical process. So step one will be to propose the use and set the intended outcome. So for our case, we wanted the GBA to provide both cognitive and personality data on the candidates, and we will use this data to guide our shortlisting decisions. The intended outcome is as shown on the screen, and also what I have mentioned earlier. So step two will be the designing of the validation effort, where in our case, we decided to review the GBA's technical manual for the vendor, which detailed the validation studies done by the vendor to test and also validate the GBA tool. At the same time, we also considered the pros and cons of trying out the GBA. So doing so actually helped to reduce the risk of us trying out GBA since we were able to have a quick preliminary evaluation of the GPA's value and suitability. This helps to facilitate the decision-making on whether to continue further exploration of the GPA. So in consideration of the positive results from the tech manual and also the potential benefits that the tool could bring, we decided to accept the ambiguity and limited research around the GPA and to continue exploration of it in our scholarship process. So with that in mind, we proceeded on to the designing of the validation effort for our pilot study. So step 3 will be the pilot testing, where there will be data collection and analysis. So in our case, we wanted to trial the GPA on both incumbents and also our potential target population. So this meant that we trialed the GPA on 3 different groups. Number 1, existing scholars. Number 2, in-service officers. And number 3, potential candidates. So the reason why we trialed on 3 different groups, and these 3 different groups in particular, was because we wanted to reduce the risk by first trying out the GPA on our existing groups that we have access to instead of the actual target population first. At the same time, doing so was also in relation with one of the complexities I mentioned earlier about the difficulty in establishing predictive criterion validity. As a result of this difficulty, we chose to do concurrent criterion validation first, where we utilize both direct and indirect performance data. The direct performance data was collected from the existing scholars and in-service officers in the form of work performance ratings as well as supervisor ratings. And this data was collected in this phase. At the same time, we also did concurrent validation with indirect performance data collected from our candidates in the later stages. And this consisted of data like interview performance ratings as well as the outcome decision to award. So doing so actually helps to provide the benefit of allowing us to evaluate the criterion validity without having to wait years for the results. So when we took a look at the data we collected, we saw that the results were generally quite positive, and this led to our decision to continue to pilot tests on our target population, which is the scholarship candidates. However, we also recognize that the construct and criterion validity were not as ideal as we wanted it to be. Bearing that in mind, we decided to reduce the risk of trying out the GPA by using it as an additional source of candidate data instead of using it for shortlisting as we initially intended. Not only that, we also employed flexibility by deciding to place a greater focus on criterion validity over construct validity. The reason for this was because we recognized that the GPA had an innovative methodology, which might make it less comparable to the traditional assessment tools that we were comparing it with when doing construct validity. Hence, there was a greater focus on criterion validity if it could be established. In relation to this point, we also developed something called the fit profile scores, which is essentially a combination of trait scores to develop a profile of the candidate. So we wanted to see if this profile score would help to improve criterion validity. So in making these decisions, it actually brought about the benefits on enabling us to trial the GPA with our actual target population of scholarship candidates. And we could also compare the GPA tool with our current existing assessment tools that we were using to assess the scholarship candidates. Of course, it also gave us a chance to experiment with the newly developed fit profiles. Up to here, our validation process has been quite similar to a typical one, but here is where it starts to get a little different. So instead of stopping at just one pilot test, we decided to do a second round of pilot tests, and this time, as I mentioned, on our target group of scholarship candidates. When we saw the results, they were moderate, but overall still positive. And so we made the decision to continue implementing or trialing the GPA tool on our target group. However, we decided to modify the approach that we're taking and actually to trial the use of the GPA for shortlisting. So the decision to do so was to enable us to do further testing and collection of one more round of data of the GPA with the target population. At the same time, it also allowed us to trial the GPA for shortlisting as we wanted to do in the first place. So step 5 would be, since we wanted to modify the use of tool, we had to redesign the validation effort. We actually made the decision to pilot trial as GBA in a sandbox setting for this shortlisting process. And we did this by introducing an additional alternative pathway for shortlisting candidates. This meant that candidates who were previously not shortlisted based on the existing shortlisting criteria could now be shortlisted if their GBA data showed that they possess the desirable traits. So creating this additional pathway helps to minimize the effect on the existing selection process, since this pathway is separate from the rest. At the same time, it allowed us to trial the GBA while limiting any potential adverse impact without compromising on psychometric rigor. So with that, we moved on to our third round of pilot tests, and we collected more data on the scholarship candidates, as I mentioned, as well as one more on our in-service scholars. So what we saw was that the findings were quite mixed, with some of the results being inconsistent with previous years. So in view of this, we decided to perform a meta-analysis to consolidate all the results. So doing the meta-analysis actually is beneficial in helping us to have an overview of all the validation results across the different populations and phases. And this enables us to have a holistic assessment of the GBA's effectiveness. So having said that, we've come to the end of the validation process, where we are required to give our recommendation. And part of this involves having to reflect on the process and findings that we had. So to answer the golden question, do we recommend use of the GBA? We will still say that the jury is still out because we don't see strong evidence to give approval for use. At the same time, we also want to acknowledge that there was high face validity with users and test takers. Anecdotally, there was also some evidence of its usefulness, although the statistical evidence showed less support for use in the assessment and selection context for this particular GBA tool that we have tried. To round out my sharing, we would also like to share some of the practices and the reflections that we gained along the way. So number one, we practiced objectivity. This involved deep consideration and weighing of both the pros and cons of the GBA. Trying the GBA was actually a leap of faith for us, and we did it instead of waiting for maturity because we recognized the importance and benefits of keeping on top of the developments in the tools for selection and assessment field. However, we also made sure that we were aware of the benefits and uncertainties that the tool could bring, with the final decision made to give it more room for exploration. At the same time, we also practice agility, where we apply agility in decision making. While we recognize that we did not always get the desired results that we wanted, we are satisfied that we provided a full opportunity for the GBA to showcase its potential. One of the ways we did this was by sandboxing the GBA in our trials to manage the risk. At the same time, we also employ agility by modifying the use of the tool accordingly based on the results that we saw. For example, we first started out by using it as an additional source of data, followed by trialing it for shortlisting in the last stage. In relation to this point, we also practice flexibility in the process of testing the tool. For example, we focus less on construct validity over criterion validity if it could be established, because we saw and recognized the GBA's difference in methodology. We also tried to do concurrent criterion validation when the predictive criterion validation was difficult. We also accepted ambiguity and the limited research around the tool, but made the effort to do more testing. Last but not least, we also practiced Rigour, where we ensured rigorous testing and validation while exploring the GBA tool. One of the ways we did this was by ensuring that those who would have been qualified would not be cut off by the GBA results alone. At the same time, we also conducted preliminary checks, multiple rounds of pilot tests, and meta-analysis to evaluate the GBA holistically. So looking back, we would actually still choose to explore use of the tool, because we feel that it's not just about the exploration of the tool itself, but also experimentation of the process, which was a journey we learned a lot from. At the same time, Taking on the decision to explore the use of the GBA provided us with the opportunity to educate the users and also review the existing assessment tools that we had. All in all, we're really not giving up on GBAs. This process gave us insights on what to look out for in future tools, and hence we will continue to explore more potentially value-adding tools, both GBA and non-GBA ones. Thank you.